So what I'll be covering today is, hold on, I'm trying to see my screen. Yeah. I'll be talking about learning design and development, just some key components. And this will be helpful for the two, not for the instructional designers that are already have a lot of experience, but for the other two categories, which is, I don't know, it was quite a large percentage. I think 90% of you, just kind of an overview. And if you have questions as I share it, you can also ask those questions in text chat, because we've got some experts in the audience, and maybe some of them will help me answer some of those questions. Then I will talk about our changing context. What is the future of work? Because since I'm looking at it in this whole topic in the context of future of work, let's just be on the same page in terms of what we understand as the future of work. And then we look at the relationship between the two. So future of work, impact on learning. And I want to wrap up with some actions that you can take. And really, all of these sessions, and, we've had, another 11 in the last, over the last couple of weeks. And you've probably attended webinars in different places. I think it's really important for each of us to think about some key takeaway that I'm going to apply after the session. So, a lot of it is on you, but I also want to help that process along, because ultimately, if we come out of the session saying, oh, wow, brilliant presentation, that was a great idea, and then we just go back to our work, the same normal work, then I wouldn't have really achieved any purpose. So I do want to push all of you, and I mean, I keep pushing myself as well, to think about how am I going to apply this? What's the different behavior I'm going to put into play after learning this? Because and I think you have to think about that in terms of your context, and then see what you can do. All right. So let's get started on learning design and development. What are some key components? So I'm going to start with Okay, here we go. Key components of learning design and development. And I'm just going to go through a couple of things, and I've got a few graphics to support my efforts. So one aspect is the fact that learning is social. And I think we all widely accept that today, especially in a time of COVID, where we've seen, those of us who are parents have seen our children have to suffer not having that social component of learning, and how it inhibits learning to some extent. But certainly for adults as well, the social aspect of learning is an important one. And so when we design learning, it is important to incorporate some element of the social in it. So keep that in mind. And so think about these points as I share them. What I will invite you to do is, as I share these points, to reflect on some of the learning programs that you've seen, either attended or facilitated, or seen delivered, or maybe something that you're assessing, and look at them in terms of, are those programs really fulfilling some of these criteria? Okay, so learning is social, that's one. Learning is experiential as well. And when we say it's experiential, you can see this Kolb learning model, experiential learning cycle that's mentioned here at the bottom right in the page. And that's really about how when we learn through experience, one can create, you have a concrete experience, you then reflect on that. From that reflection, you come up with a hypothesis of, this is what happens when I do this. And then from that, you draw some kind of an abstract point, which then you can try to apply to say, okay, if I did it differently, let me try differently. You do an active experiment in something different, and that's how that cycle keeps moving. So that ideally, that cycle moves in an upward spiral and enables you to experientially see how the different behavior results in different outcomes. Okay, so that's another way in which we learn, through experience. And in a learning program, a lot of that happens through simulations, for example, because that gives us a feel of something without actually, doing it in real life, with all the dangers associated with going into it in real life. So it's kind of a safe environment to do it in. Okay. Neuroscience and learning. Now, this is a whole new area, well, relatively new area, but basically there's a lot of research still continuing on the whole area of how is our brain affected physically. I don't mean just mentally. Obviously, we all know mentally our brain, our cognition levels, etc., require the usage of the brain. But I mean physically, biologically, the brain also gets impacted by new learning. And so some of the things that one has learned from that experience have helped incorporate components into learning design. So, I've mentioned a couple of them here. So one of them being need to reinforce to retain. So if I give an example, it's like if you were on a empty field of grass and you were trying to get a shortcut. So instead of walking the trodden path, you cut across a field of grass. You can look back at that field and you probably won't see much difference if you're one person cutting across that field of grass. But on the other hand, if you had 2, 3, 22, 23, 32, 55, 100 people following you on that same path, you would then look back at that field and you'd suddenly realize a pathway has been created in the middle of a field. So that's how a lot of the learning in our brains also works. If something is repeated, it helps to reinforce the learning. And for helping people to remember certain things, you need to find ways in your learning design to repeat it different ways so that that path, the neuron path in our brains gets set. And then after that, you remember what happens when you do something or the other. Another point here is about use it or lose it. And that's really in a way, it's connected with experiential learning. It's really about activating the learning. So it's really taking action on the learning. If you just think about it as an idea, like I said at the start, not as powerful in terms of kind of getting the learning set in your mind. All right. Okay, theories on learning process. And here, there are many different theories on learning process. If you Google them, you'll probably, there'll just be a whole bunch. I've just listed a couple of these, but my main purpose here is really to emphasize the word process, the acknowledgement that learning is not an event, it's a journey, it's a process. And it can go in different ways for different people, but the acceptance of the fact that it's a process means that when we do learning design, we also want to create a journey in the design. We can't just have one event and then expect that the learning is done. Now we can wash our hands over it. It's really thinking, how can you make this continuous? How can you bring in some of these other elements to reinforce it? Because it is a process. It's not going to happen immediately. 70-20-10 model is one of the ways in which we learn. So it's showing the different means through which we learn. So 70% of our learning happens through doing. So that's the experiential component. 20% is through learning from others. And that really is about the relationship aspect and the social learning as well. So it links up with what we talked about earlier. And so it's just really 10% that is that event, that course that you've designed. So also being aware that there are these other components and the fact that you can create much more holistic learning if you integrate those components with what's happening in the organization. So rather than having just one intervention and then getting out, how is that intervention linked with other stuff that the trainee or the learner is doing, whether it's their appraisal process or whether it's some other activity that they're going to do in terms of a project that they can then apply it in, etc. If all those elements are linked together, it makes learning much more effective. And another way of looking at the same 70-20-10 model is experience, the 3E model, experience, exposure, and education. So the education being 10%, exposure, which is things like, it might be a mentorship or a stretch assignment, or, often involving a relationship with somebody else, and you learn from that relationship, a coach. And then you've got, so that's exposure and then experience. So if you look at this list now, it probably looks a little bit like a laundry list of different elements to do with learning, design, and development. And in a way, it is a bit of a laundry list, but I'm not done yet. So let's look also at, when we consider learning design, we must also consider motivation, because motivation is a key part of learning design. And we have to think about the motivation of our sponsor and also the motivation for the learner. So in terms of the sponsor, what is in it for me needs to be answered very clearly. I mean, the sponsor is the one paying for the learning. The sponsor is the one that has really asked for it. So what's in it for them? What is the purpose? What is the outcome that he or she, your sponsor, wants, is important to understand and make sure that that is fulfilled in your learning design. And then when you consider the what's in it for the learner, I mean, there are many ways to build in motivational components in learning. So the carrot and stick is one way to look at it. Some people don't quite like that analogy, but in my view, having a good balance of carrot and stick in fact really helps learning to hold. So you can have carrots like, giving people a badge or a certificate because they've attended the learning, but it's also nice to have a stick to say, if you don't do the learning, then maybe you will not be eligible for a promotion, or maybe you will not be allowed to attend the next level of learning because this is a prerequisite, or, things like that. So entry and exit barriers for incorporated in the learning that you're delivering. So gamification is another. You could look at it as a carrot or a stick. Some people really like the competitive aspect of it. So there's the carrot of getting extra points, or the carrot of being able to win, or the stick of, I don't want to be the one who's going to lose. So it's also, how does it get perceived by the learner? But if you have a combination of carrot and stick in your learning design, I think it really helps. And then I've got a point here about learning measurement. And, a simple way to look at it is, does it work? Is it of value? Is it efficient? You really need to think about those three questions when you're designing learning. The does it work part, is it of value to the learner? So that involves you really understanding what the learner is about, who your audience is, and then are you delivering it in the most efficient way? So there may be constraints in terms of resources, in terms of the locations of the individuals, etc. So whatever those constraints are you doing it in the most efficient way? So that's a few more on learning design, and I've got just one last one. Sorry, here we go. Which is that learners have preferences. So that's one last point that I want to also have you think about when you consider learning design and development. And that's just to, a lot of the work on learners' learning styles has actually in the recent past been debunked, in the sense that people took the learning styles and said, okay, if I'm, for example, a visual learner, I will learn much better if I see everything visually. And there were experiments done to show that, hey, that's not really true. Even though I'm primarily a visual learner, I need that balance of something different as well. I can't just learn only visually, because then I'll get really tired of just the visual reinforcement. So some of it has been debunked, but I find that the learning styles and preferences, all the research on it, and there are some simple models, some more complex. So I've shown just a smattering of some of them that were easy to find in terms of graphics. But it's very helpful for a learning designer, because when you're designing training, if you consider the variety of learning styles, it helps you to design a program that will appeal to multiple learning styles. And if you design something that appeals to multiple learning styles, while you don't know your audience and what their styles are. So ultimately, it will make your training program more holistic in its approach. So the slide on the left here, the visual, auditory, and kinesthetic, also includes some points on what are some components you can incorporate in learning if you consider learning styles and preferences. So if it's visual, you want to have some more graphs and illustration. If it's auditory, you want to have opportunities for oral presentations, maybe a video. If it's kinesthetic, then you want more role playing, more hands-on action learning, that kind of thing. So these are just some of the points that are relevant to consider when we talk about learning design and development. So let me just pause for a minute, because I know we have some instructional designer experts in our audience as well. are there any points that you want to add to this, that you feel, this is something that we really also should be focusing on? And maybe you could use the text chat, whatever's your preference. If you want to, let me just see if I can see the text chat right now. Yeah, so if you could, if you want to add anything, let me just open chat. Okay, here we go. Okay, I don't see any text chats. Oh, wait, here we go, 5 messages. So any model would you like to recommend for VILs? Could you, the person who said VILs, Nitesh, could you tell me what a VIL is? I don't know that acronym.
Hi, I'm so sorry. I think acronym I have faced it. But nowadays, during considering the pandemic situation, I see like all of us, we are delivering the virtual instructor-led training program, how we are having it right now. So I understand, given a scenario where we are into a classroom session, we can do many things as an instructor. However, during the virtual mode, there are very less which we can do it because the interaction is something which is very limited. So, is there any model or way you would like to recommend for virtual led?
I think, I will answer the question in the easiest way possible, which is it depends. It is really hard to say that in a generic sense, because it depends what you're teaching. It depends on who your audience is and things like that. We in IBM, we use the term ILT, instructor-led training, and LVC, live virtual classroom. So those are the acronyms I'm used to. So I wasn't familiar with this, but it's clearly one I should get used to. VIL, it makes more sense. IBM has their own acronyms sometimes. But I would say incorporating all of these elements into, even like, because you don't have a certain thing, to see what can you compensate for it would be quite helpful. So consider what you can do within your constraints. And personally, I find the concept of constraints not, sometimes when you think of constraints, you think, oh God, I've got all these things surrounding me that are hurdles and I can't operate, I've got limited area to operate. But I'd like to encourage you to think about constraints in the way poets think about writing poetry. This is the way I'm not a poet myself, but the way I see poetry is that, poetry has certain very strict constraints about the meter or the rhythm, or, of course, I'm not talking about contemporary poetry, but, in general, traditional poetry, you've got certain requirements. Let's say a sonnet has to be written a certain way. There's iambic pentameter for Shakespeare, whatever. You have a certain very fixed grid. And because you've got that framework, it forces you to create something really profound, because that constraint forces the greatness to come through. So I find that if we have this constraint, it's a terrible constraint that we all have to work virtually. There is also an opportunity from that constraint to say, what is that profound something I can come through it? So I would encourage you to not think about it as a major constraint, but see what more we can do. All right. So let's now move from here to looking at the future of work. And, we've talked about, I don't know if you've heard this expression when we think about the future of work. The future of work is now. Has anybody heard that expression? You can just give me a yes or a thumbs up if that expression has ever come up anywhere. The future of work is now. No? Okay, I'm not seeing the thumbs, so maybe I'm not able to notice them. Okay, but what I'd like to encourage you to do now in the text chat is to, okay, there's some no's and some yeses, all right? In the text chat to just type out, and rather than a long sentence, 1 or 2 words on what are some components of the future of work as you see them. And look, there's really no right or wrong answer. Of course, there are these so-called futurist experts who can really use analytics and all this stuff to predict the future. But the reality is that none of us really knows what the future holds. So, okay, we are seeing some virtual, digital, remote working, technology, digital, virtual, remote, gig working, work lean fusion, work from home, work learn fusion, Okay, great. Some excellent thoughts here. Okay, so there's a lot of ideas here for what does the future blended, right? Excellent. Gamification, new skills, competencies. So I mean, right now, maybe don't necessarily limit yourself to a learning context. Just say future of work. Don't limit yourself. I think some of you have been just unlimited in your thinking, but some of you are straight away starting to frame it in the learning language. Agile learning, flexible, on-demand workforce. Okay, these are great comments. I'm going to actually afterwards ask Imsu Sangla to like copy them and keep them for me so that I can have them on my, like a list of things, because I think you guys are coming up: artificial intelligence, virtual collaboration, new jobs, the on-demand workforce. Okay, so there's a lot here. And what I'm going to do, and yeah, I showed those graphics because it was also to try and kind of help you to think about it, and also to think about what are your feelings towards the future of work, because I think we sometimes approach it with mixed feelings, sometimes with apprehension, sometimes with hope, sometimes with, fingers crossed, kind of, wondering, but excited, anticipation. Okay, so we can see some of the feelings also being shared. Excellent. So what I'd like to do is maybe pick two of the elements that you have actually shared here and unpack them a little bit. And when I say unpack them, I want to try to illustrate what really is the impact of these two in general, and we can look at the learning implications later, but just in general to start with. So I'll do it with two that I pick, but the idea is that I would encourage you to pick to do that with more of these elements. So, to on your own, take some of them, find a partner to have a discussion with, and start unpacking some of the others, because I think that itself is a helpful exercise to start looking at the implications of what is the future coming. Okay. And I see some more feelings also expressed. Abimbola about sometimes being fearful, and it's great that you're being honest with that. Absolutely, I shared that scream picture because sometimes I do feel exactly like that, like, oh my God, what's gonna happen, So definitely sometimes fear, but there's also hope, there's also anticipation. So we look at it in many different ways. So the two that I want to pick, that I'll focus on, one is about digitization. And I think many of you have mentioned that point already, that, the digital workplace, the fact that things are moving to digital. And a second is the nature of talent. So I don't think anybody has specifically mentioned talent, nature of in those words, but I think from some of the inputs that I've seen from let me just see. Some folks did mention talent-related points, new skills, competencies. I saw there was work from home, there was gig working. So some of those points did come up. So let's unpack each of them and see what it looks like. All right. So we'll start with digitization. All right. So when we look at digitization, first, just in terms of, just so that we have a common definition, digitization, we are looking at it as data in the form of text, sound, or video. And so what are some of the implications of that? So one basic one is just that it's much easier to turn data into information. And especially if it's digital, it's much easier because, if all your data is sitting inside a bunch of folders in a file somewhere, then to try and understand it is going to be that much harder. But as soon as you put it onto a worksheet, so just the simplest way of just converting that, it becomes data that you can then translate it into information. You can do some analysis on it. You can look at trends. You can do all of that. So it's much easier to turn data into information when it is digitized. So that's one impact. So I'm going to share a few more. It's possible to share remotely, which maybe earlier you couldn't transfer huge amounts of, in like data if it wasn't digitized to other people. You had to, it was difficult to do, but now it's quite easy to just transfer huge files here and there and everywhere. I mean, even now, me having this conversation with you is transferring information. You're in multiple time zones and we're doing it in real time. Okay. It's possible, and that possible to share remotely also implies the whole work from home movement. I mean, that has an implication there. Possible to automate, especially repetitive tasks. So digitization helps in that automation process. It makes data mobile when it's digitized, and we all have our mobile phones. That makes it, you're not constrained by some machine. I mean, I guess the mobile is also a kind of a machine, but it's much more, your mobile, you can get it anytime, any place. There's the equity of a common platform. And by this, I mean that, here we are, all of us together on this common platform called Zoom. And, I can say something and you can say something, and we are both in an equal platform to speak about it. Maybe you are the expert, but I can also chime in and my voice can also be heard. So there's a certain equality and equity that comes out because of the fact that things are available digitally in this way, okay? There's also an expectation of speed because data is digital. We've all sort of started taking for granted that, look, if you write a mail, you're going to get, if you send a message, you're going to get a response immediately. You expect it because you know that people have mobiles, they'll get the message, they're going to respond. Your WhatsApp messages, if you don't get a response, you start getting stressed, right? And there's also an expectation of choice, and that choice especially relates, for example, to multimedia, the fact that data is available in multiple ways. And I might have a choice that I prefer to hear stuff on a video, somebody else likes podcasts, somebody likes to see a transcript of material. So I can say, I choose not only the way in which I see data, but also when I see it, how I see it, etc. So that choice has become something that we all now take for granted. And that's an aspect also of digitization, all right? And then there's also this side of privacy and security, which is coming up with digitization. So because our data is digital, so many people can get to know things about me that maybe I don't want them to know. And so security goes hand in hand with the privacy of, how do we maintain this data in a safe way? So these are some examples of how just, we talked about a fact, digitization, and it's part of the future of work, and part of the future of work being now, in fact, heavily accelerated because of COVID. But when you actually look at the implications of it, the implications don't just touch what you're going to do at work or your learning organization. They touch things that are political, social, emotional, etc. So, just seeing that impact is important to realize. So if we look at a similar way, we look at the nature of talent, then we can similarly see some of the ways in which talent also has, some of the impact of that. And so, I'm sharing some of the points, and I think some of it is repetitive because you guys have already put it in the text chat, which just shows that this is a very experienced audience and you have a lot to offer to share already. So gig workers, of course, that's this whole idea of freelance work by experts offering their freelance work is something that has really come up and grown hugely in the whole gig economy. Skills as the new currency. So people really now see skills as the currency. That is what you're trading in. And so learning new skills is something that people aspire to and want. And this is obviously a positive also for us in the learning professional area. And on the top left, you can see these the picture here of T-shaped, pie-shaped, and comb-shaped skills. So we used to say that it's good to focus on T-shaped skills, that is a breadth of knowledge across many different areas and a specialization in one core area. And that's the way a lot of us used to teach learning, and our education systems have been focused on that. But over time, we've realized T-shaped is not enough, because suppose your area of expertise and specialization is an area that suddenly becomes redundant in the digitized age. So people have realized you need at least pie-shaped skills, so at least 2 areas of specialization. And now even that's proving to be not enough. So people are speaking of comb-shaped skills, which is a very tough prospect, to become a specialist in multiple areas, as well as have the breadth of knowledge across many fields. But that is what the new demand is of our learners today, that they need to have a fairly good depth of multiple areas so that they can jump from one to the other if there's a change in circumstance or situation. Other implications of the nature of talent is a bigger focus on employability over employment. Our talent is no longer really looking for full-time employment. They're really looking at, is this job going to make me more employable? Because I don't know anymore if the company is going to keep me for my lifetime. I don't know if this company is going to last a lifetime, but I know that if I'm going to learn, then I've got a much better opportunity to be employable somewhere else, whether it's on my own or in another organization. The whole attract, develop, retain models that we have are kind of upended because of the nature of talent and the future of work. Because let's say even attracting talent, if I talk about gig workers, the way we attract gig workers is going to be different from the way we attract other talent, right? In IBM, we speak of this term new collar workers. So you've probably heard of blue collar and white collar workers, but we are also talking about developing the new collar workers, which are really technically expert workers who don't necessarily have a traditional degree, but they've developed the technology because they've had access to the internet, they've been interested and passionate, and we don't want to bar them from getting hired into IBM just because they are not graduates, right? So we are really exploring, how do we tap into this talent? Maybe they can't afford, they couldn't afford a graduation education. Maybe they just were not interested and they were passionate about something else. And yet we need to look at ways in which we attract that kind of candidate as well. And similarly, develop and retain different ways in which we motivate people. Individual, organization, as well as the planet. And this is, a lot of the future is also about thinking about this point, sustainability, really not only focusing on the here and now, but focusing on the future and making sure that what we do is sustainable. Personal and professional has been emphasized, especially during COVID, when all of our personal lives are now wide open to the public, because the offices come into our living rooms and our bedrooms, so it makes it's obviously had an impact on us, and it's made us all conscious of the fact that, look, I want to also have a personal life, and it's valid to demand that I have a personal life as well, and that I can't just be a workaholic, right? Then awareness of bias and female empowerment are the last 2 points here. And this is really another aspect of the nature of talent, is that because of all other movements like the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter movement, a lot of underrepresented minorities, and the women are the most obvious one among them, are coming up in a much more strong way as being acknowledged, to be recognized. It's recognized that the bias has existed and we need to find ways to overcome it. So that's also an aspect of talent that we must recognize. So we've looked at, how, again, something simple like nature of talent is changing in the future has widespread implications, not only on the way in which our learning operates, but also just socially, politically, how we view the world. And all of that is part of what's changing. Okay, so we've looked at now let's look at both of these in terms of implications on learning. And when I started preparing these charts, I thought, okay, I'll just pick the ones that are relevant for learning and we'll highlight that. But then what happened is, as I went down each item on the list, I figured, my goodness, every one of these has an impact on learning. And in fact, in different ways, we need to now look at learning also in this holistic way. We need to think, what is the future? See some of these implications, and then start saying, what are we going to do with our learners, considering this is the new environment in which they're working. This is the kind of context in which they're operating. So I'm not going to take one at a time, and I'm not going to elaborate. By the way, I just wanted to double check. I think I have 10 more minutes. Is that correct understanding of time?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we can have the Q&A. Yes.
Okay, cool. So I want to then therefore move straight to what can you take from here? And I have what can you do from what the discussion that we've just had, and some of which you have also shared and contributed to. So there are 2 points that I want to leave you with. So one is around the outside in and inside out approach. So what I've just taken you through on the future of work is really an outside in approach. It's really looking out at the world and saying, okay, here's what do I see in the world? And then looking at the implications of that. So whether it's digitization or the nature of talent, or the various other items that technology, just technology as an item on its own, or the fact that we are now in a remote environment because of COVID, maybe that's an item to take. And then what are the implications? So in addition to that, though, it's important to also do an inside out view. And the inside out view starts with you saying, what is important to you? So you need to, for the outside in, you need to hone your sense making ability. And each of us needs to do this. And we can do it by participating in conferences like these. That's one of the ways. By interacting with people with diverse views is another way. I mean, there are many different ways in which we can hone our sense making ability, essentially develop the ability to see around corners. There's a very nice TED talk that actually talks about how it's important now to learn to see around corners. Very difficult to do, but something we all need to develop. And the inside out is really identifying our own priorities, so that, if we have both, then I think each of us can start finding the right blend of what it is that we need. So that's one key takeaway that I'd like you to think about and apply. More outside in discussions and more reflection on inside out. And the second one is find ways to build resilience into the learning, design, and development that you have in your organization. And building resilience in this case really means there are two ways that I can suggest you to do it. One is a checklist approach. So this is a simple checklist. You take the list that we've just talked about of the various components of learning, design, and development, and use that as a checklist to say, hey, here's some learning that is happening in my organization. Does it fulfill the elements in this checklist? And look, it doesn't have to fulfill every single one, but if it fulfills a large number of them, then you can satisfactorily feel that, hey, okay, I think this learning is delivering on what we wanted it to do in the way in which we wanted to deliver. Okay, so that's one way of using the checklist. It also helps you to have more intelligent conversations with the learning provider, because you can actually say, well, there's nothing social in your learning, or can you bring in an experiential component? So you can sometimes bring in some of those elements and, make it a little more the conversation, and they will understand what you're talking about, right? So checklist approach. And the second one is, with credit to Stephen Covey, begin with the end in mind, which is really emphasize thinking about what is the impact you want to achieve, and then work backwards from there on what's the best way, the most effective way to deliver that. Okay.